Welcome everyone who's joining us today in person and online. My name is Ben Bland. I'm the director of the Asia Pacific program here at Chatham House. It's great to have you all with us virtually, and especially people who've taken the time to travel on this very cold London lunchtime. So thanks again for being with us. We're going to be talking about a really important subject today, which is India's global role. It's been a big year for India, as Chitij, who I'll introduce in a second, keeps reminding me. G20 presidency, India's become the world's most populous nation. It's now the fastest growing major Asian economy and had a successful lunar mission. And we're going to be talking about whether or not India can be the next global superpower and what that might mean in practice. We're really lucky to be joined by four great experts and practitioners today. Joining us virtually from New Delhi is Ambassador Shyam Saran, author, thinker, former Foreign Secretary of India and Chairman of India's National Security Advisory Board. His other great distinguished achievements and books are all online, so you can look them up yourselves. Next to me, we have in person Louise Tillen, who's Professor of Politics at the India Institute at King's College London. Next to Louise, we have Chitij Bajpai, my new colleague, our new Senior Research Fellow for South Asia, who's done a great job getting up to speed in his first few months at a very busy time for India and the world. And last but not least, we have Kevin McColl, who's Managing Director of the UK-India Business Council and a former British diplomat in India. So thanks again. The way this is going to work today, I'm going to ask questions to the panelists for about 35 or 40 minutes on a range of topics. Then we're going to open up to the floor for your questions in person. Just raise your hand later on, catch my eye, and I'll come to you. If you're online, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and I will read them out on your behalf if they're appropriate and interesting. And yeah, questions, not statements, later on. But for now, let's get straight into it. And I want to come to you first, Ambassador, just to ask, this big question that we're here to talk about today. I mean, do you think India can move from being a serious regional power to a global superpower in the foreseeable future?
So let me try to give you a Indian perspective. As far as India's macro impact over the global landscape is concerned, it is certainly expanding. But in terms of the domestic metrics of development, I think those are changing very slowly. So on the one hand, India is, in terms of GDP, today the fifth largest, fifth ranking economy. But its ranking in Human Development Index is dismal at 132 out of 191 countries. And progress has been very slow. So this creates almost a kind of a schizophrenic approach to external relations. On the one hand, India is a demander of global public goods to promote its own development. But at the same time, it aspires to be what is known as the global high table, precisely because of its very, large and expanding global footprint. Now, there will be issues on which India will behave very much as part of the global South. So certainly not in the great power or even superpower category. But there will be other issues, like, for example, climate change, where India has, in fact, a very major role to play. It would, in fact, be, in a sense, regarded as a key player. And so it is very easy to see that there is a kind of a contradiction between these two facets of India's, foreign policy. So you will also see that, generally speaking, India is seen as a good partner in bilateral relations, but sometimes it is adversarial when it comes to the multilateral fora. And this is, you always see, for example, in India's relations with the US. This is why I said that when we are looking at the possibility of India being the next superpower, I think you have to take into account these contradictions. In a larger perspective, I could certainly say that given the size of its population, the scale of its economy, the fact that it has no doubt a great economic potential. It has a very sizable pool of scientific and technical manpower. Reference has been made to India's successes, for example, both in nuclear energy as well as its space program. So I think it certainly has the potential to catch up what is its peer power, in a sense, the closest rival, which is China, to catch up and perhaps even exceed, go beyond China in various metrics of power. Whether it will actually do so is, of course, another question altogether. To me, it is not only the possibility that India may emerge as the next superpower, but to what purpose it actually ends up using that power. Will it be a selfish power, as China seems to be increasingly becoming, or will it stand for something other than itself? As the first Indian Prime Minister Nehru spoke about. So the political trajectory that India will traverse in its pursuit of power will be as important in whether or not it achieves, in fact, that status. And that finally includes the health of its own plural democracy as well. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And Louisa, I might come to you then on this question of sort of what India wants, and particularly, I guess, what does Prime Minister Narendra Modi want? What is his sort of particular flavor when it comes to India's place in the world? How do you think he sees India's role in the world, and what are the issues where he thinks India should be playing a decisive global role as opposed to just a regional one?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a period in which India has developed a much more muscular and assertive foreign policy, and in which Narendra Modi's attempt to counter or change global perceptions of India has played both internationally, but also very importantly, domestically as well. So this is a foreign policy agenda that is very intimately shaped by the BJP's political project at home. Of course, India for a long time has sought change in the institutions of global governance, and for good reason. It doesn't have a permanent seat on the Security Council. Its requests, demands for reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, are long-standing, legitimate claims for recognition on the world stage. But I think Narendra Modi has gone beyond those demands for recasting the institutions of global governance and making space for India within a kind of liberal world order to asserting India's status as in itself a civilizational power, and one which has status ambitions that rival those of other claimants to civilizational great power status, China in particular, but not only China, of course. And so what does that mean? I think it means, in some instances, and we've seen that very recently, for instance, in the tensions with Canada, a more uncompromising willingness to defend India's interests, to disrupt a kind of what Modi would and his and the BJP regime, I think, would see as a somewhat cozy liberal consensus about what India was or is, to present what India's Minister of External Affairs, Jaishankar, described in London just a few weeks ago as a more authentic vision of what India is. And of course, with that, a willingness to assert India's identity not only as a civilizational power, but as a Hindu civilizational power. And of course, alongside that, an effort to both hard politics, but also soft power politics as well. That India has a lot to offer the world. Modi uses the term Vishwaguru, teacher to the world. That India is not, is an aspirational rising power with claims to offer a lot to the world as well.
I think when I come back to the question of Canada-India relations, which I guess many people thought wasn't a subject of great interest until relatively recently, but I want to sort of stick with this question of sort of what sort of India wants in the world, because I think much of what you were talking about, Louise, was really about sort of projecting India out onto the world in a more sort of authoritative, assertive way. But I mean, Kshitij, if I come to you, are there things that the Modi government wants to change in the world, global norms that they want to change? Are there ways in which they want to change the global system that aren't just, as Ambassador sort of Saram saying, to protect India in some specific way, but to actually promote a different way of organizing our world?
Well, I think, first and foremost, Indian foreign policy, like foreign policy of any country, is driven by national self-interest. So, whether it be its position on the conflict in the Middle East or the war in Ukraine, it's always self-interest that lies at the heart of that. That being said, I think there are three key facets or characteristics of Indian foreign policy, which it's trying to project on the world. One is this position of long-standing position of strategic autonomy or multi-alignment or omni-alignment or whatever we want to call it. So that means engaging all major poles of influence in the international system. And in that context, it's a somewhat more benign worldview than that being offered by China. So although India is offering a non-Western worldview, it's not an anti-Western or an overtly anti-Western worldview. Related to that is being this so-called voice of the global South. And we very much saw this during its G20 presidency, the admission of the African Union, reaching out to over 120 countries in the global South, and also, trying to put forward a sort of Indian solution to global problems, whether it be issues related to climate change, digital public infrastructure, global health. And that, I think, that brings us to the third point, which Louise has alluded to, is that India is presenting itself as a civilizational state, and essentially, again, as a Vishwaguru, offering Indian solutions to global problems. So I think those are some of the, the key facets of sort of the Indian worldview and what it seeks to bring to the table on the foreign policy front.
And I might come to you, Kevin, on the sort of the economic question, because clearly in terms of overall size alone, India is becoming more and more significant. Its ability to deploy key technologies, obviously, as Ambassador Saran said, a lot of economic inequality within India. But I think India's economic rise is often greeted sort of in the UK and in the West as sort of an unrivaled good thing. But is it clear to you that that's the case? I mean, is it naturally a great thing for the UK, or do you think, as India grows economically, it's actually on economic questions as well, going to want to have a different way of doing things that may not necessarily be, in the advantage of the UK and other free market, mostly free market economies?
I think, as Kshitij said, India's foreign policy, like others, has got to be, India-centric. It's put your own country first. And it's up to the UK, I think, to find ways of aligning its interests with India's interests. Long gone are the days, if they ever existed, where India would act in other countries' interests or put them first. And I think the ambassador posed it as a question, will India be a selfish superpower? I think we've heard from Louise and Kshitij that that's not the case, and I would agree with that. And I think India's engaging with the global South and developing nations, but it's much more broad than that, I think. And someone mentioned Mr. Jaishankar at the UN General Assembly, and if I can quote some of the things that he said, the goals we, India, have set ourselves will make us different from all those whose rise preceded ours. So they do want to take a different path from China or the USA. And then, from an era of non-alignment, we've evolved a Vishwamitra, a friend to the world, and engaging with a broad range of nations to harmonize interests. So I think that array of nations they engage with, global South, absolutely, but also the developed world as well. If you look at the FTAs India has signed and negotiated with Australia, UEA, and negotiating with the UK and the US, India playing a prominent role in the BRICS. And again, Mr. Jaishankar described BRICS as independently minded. And that's 5 different independent minds there. And then announced at the G20 was the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. You know, who's that? India, Saudi, UAE, Germany, France, US. So all of those elements are with the developed world. And then, as Chichich said, there was the sort of the voice of the Global South Summit, bringing this the African Union into the G20 as a permanent member, and having development partnerships with like 7 to 8 different countries. So India is trying to be friends with people who will be its friends.
And Ambassador Soren, I might come to you on this question, because I mean, multi-alignment or omni-alignment sounds good, being friends with everyone, but presumably if you want to be an ever more assertive, strong power, you're going to have to take some tough choices that upset a lot of people. And you know, even if you don't, other powers, not least the US and China, but others are going to be pressuring you to take choices on all kinds of decisions. So do you think it's realistic for India to kind of take a bigger role in the world and still maintain this sort of omnidirectional alignment? Or do you think there will have to be some tougher choices in the years to come if India wants to deploy its power more effectively?
If I look back upon much of my diplomatic career, I think much of that history is of very consistently annoying our partners. So, you know, whether it is the United States of America or whether it is our European friends, I would say that we are annoying them much less today than we were during our non-aligned days. So I think one should look at this in a somewhat longer term perspective. Is India being assertive? Well, it depends upon what one means by assertive. Was India not being assertive, for example, in the 60s and the 70s of the last century? I think it was. I mean, look at the kind of position that India took, say, on the non-proliferation treaty. I mean, was willing to stand alone. Lot of criticism, lot of pressures. So I do not think that one can say, oh, India was not assertive before, but it has become assertive now. I think the manner in which India has been projecting its foreign policy is perhaps somewhat different in style from what it was before. And I think Louise has explained, you know, the domestic drivers of that particular posture that India is taking. But I would go back to what Chitij said, that you know, we are really talking about a certain remarkable consistency in Indian foreign policy from the word go, which is that, you know, on issues which are of vital interest to India, those decisions should be taken primarily in the Indian capital itself and not be outsourced to somebody else. That has not changed. Now, as far as the global south is concerned, it is to some extent similar to the non-aligned movement of the past, but in other respects is very different. Why? Because the non-aligned movement was essentially a grouping of relatively weak states, you know, whether militarily or whether economically. Today, you are talking about a global south which has several, you know, strong emerging economies, India being one of them, having greater agency in terms of foreign policy, which they did not have before. So if you look at, for example, you know, Saudi Arabia and Iran engaged in a certain, you know, détente between them, not necessarily with reference to, say, the United States of America. So you see these countries maybe not coming together as a movement, but certainly today recognizing that they have greater capability, greater power, and are willing to exercise it. So India is not an outlier in that respect, I would submit.
Thank you. I want to drill into a few key bilateral relationships, and maybe we can start with China. You know, we know that, you know, relations are not good. That's clear. But I do wonder, Chichij, and I know this is something you've written about and you think about it a lot. I mean, do you think we're actually in a new paradigm on India China relations? This deterioration has a big shift been set in motion, or do you think we could see a rapprochement and something akin to the Wuhan tea meeting between Modi and Xi? Is that feasible, and that's something that could be back on the cards? Or do you think this realignment in India's relationship with China, which obviously affects India's relationship with other key powers, including in the West, is a change that's here for good?
So it depends whom you ask. So I think in Beijing, Beijing's preference would be to return back to the status quo that existed pre-2020, the Galwan Valley clashes. I think from the Indian point of view, I think we're in a new normal. So what existed essentially from 1988 to 2020, where there was a consensus to shelve the border dispute and work on other aspects of the bilateral relationship, I think the Indians have clearly moved away from that. There's also been a shift away from the rules of engagement, the non-use of force along the border. We saw the first casualties in 45 years back in 2020. So I think from the Indian point of view, the relationship is in a new normal. I think if there's the silver lining, if there is any, is the fact that both countries are heavily focused on domestic issues. China on its domestic economic situation, India moving into elections next year, and also both countries have a high level of economic interdependence. So despite efforts by India to try and decouple or de-risk in strategically important sectors, impose restrictions on investment, banning Chinese apps, China remains India's second largest trading partner. And in particular sectors, there's a high level of interdependence, pharmaceuticals, for instance. So I think that that is to some extent going to limit the level of tension or friction. But I also think that as these two countries continue to rise as increasingly important global powers, they're going to encounter more tools and platforms to interact with each other. And that means you're going to start to see a spillover effect. So not only are you going to see tensions along the Sino-Indian border, or in the domain of their trade or economic interaction, but potentially on issues of global governance. So for instance, we saw President Xi Jinping not joining the G20 summit this year. We've seen on climate negotiations, and Ambassador Serrano, I think, would have some insight on this, that over 10 years ago, China and India were working very closely during the COP negotiations in Copenhagen, for instance. Increasingly, they're pursuing their own separate climate discussions on issues of debt sustainability as well. There are potential areas of friction. And then, of course, it's how the relationship plays out in other regions, South Asia most notably. So I think we are going to increasingly see a spillover effect as these two countries continue to rise as regional and global powers. But in terms of conflict, I think it is held back to some degree by the level of economic interdependence that exists between the two of them.
And Ambassador Serrano, I know you've also sort of written and thought a lot about India and China. I was interested to see a piece recently by Raja Mohan, who was sort of arguing that unlike America and Australia and Europeans, India shouldn't seek some sort of cooling of tensions with China because India is in a much stronger position these days vis-a-vis China. I mean, what's your sense of how should India handle the China relationship from here on out?
It has been for the last several years, there has been a kind of, cooperate where your interests are convergent and resist where you need to resist. So the change has come about because those mechanisms which actually kept the possible conflictual situations that arise at the border within limits. There were border personnel meetings, there were meetings at the diplomatic level, right up to the CMC level, the Central Military Commission level. And they were quite successful in dealing with incidents which took place at the border. What has changed over the last several years is that sort of spirit of accommodation when situations like this arise, that has been becoming thinner and thinner, but certainly on the Chinese side. Mainly because I think the Chinese feel that they are a much stronger power today. They keep reminding India that our Indian friends should realize that we are now 5 times your size. Things cannot remain the same as they were before. There is another element which has come in, which is looking at relations with India through the prism of its own rather tense confrontational relations with the United States. So India is seen as having, sort of lent over, to the US side, and therefore must be brought in lines somehow. This is likely to persist, because I cannot see a very early sort of lessening of tensions between the US and China, although recently some moves have been made in that regard. So as long as China continues to look at India through that prism, it is very difficult really to come to some kind of a common ground with regard to how we look at our respective interests, certainly in Asia, because as Kshitij was saying, there is a certain kind of overlap of peripheries, both in the Indian Ocean as well as in the subcontinent. And this is likely to, in fact, become worse as we go forward. So for India, the real challenge is, how do you hold the line? Safeguard your borders, and I think despite the gap in capabilities, India did a reasonably good job in terms of holding the line on the border, although it is not in a position, does not have the capability to try and push China out from the areas which have been occupied. But certainly it has demonstrated the capability of being able to deploy rapidly enough and on scale to be able to forestall any further incursion by China. And it is also my sense that in fact, the argument that sometimes is made that India should not provoke China by going too close to the United States, or getting into very strong security arrangements, for example, in the Quad. Quite the opposite. I think what constrains China in its relations with India is precisely that India has those networks of relationships. And I think that is precisely what is at play here. So I would imagine that what we are seeing today is a situation that is likely to persist.
Thanks. Thanks, Ambassador. And it seems obviously that that shift has been quite instrumental in the realignment of Western policy towards India as well. The sense that the West needs friends in the competition with China. But Lise, I want to ask you about this question of democracy, because while our foreign policy may be driven by these narrow interests, we like to dress it up as being about great democracies coming together. But we know that in India, democracy has been under pressure on minority rights, a rising spirit of Hindu nationalism, pressure on independent think tanks and journalists and the like. But do you think, in a general sense, before we go on some of the specifics, does this democratic backsliding, does that affect India's place in the world and how the West sees India, or is this just something that governments are happy to live with and look away, basically?
Well, I mean, I think you set out the contradiction there very nicely, which is that India has a set of common interests with many Western countries in developing a counterweight to, or becoming a counterweight to China, and yet at the same time is diverting from standards of liberal democracy. This makes it harder, of course, for Western friends to publicly criticize the evidence of democratic backsliding in India, and India itself is very bullish in both guarding against, criticisms from the West, given, the kind of what's happening to democracy in the West, but also in pointing to India's own indigenous democratic traditions, which perhaps ought to be judged with a different set of lenses. I think it's also interesting to ask the question about how the concerns about democratic erosion, which are very substantial, I mean, you've outlined some of them there, but serious decline in press freedom, in media pluralism, in the protection of minority rights, violence against minorities, the suspension of democracy and a curtailment of internet access in parts of the country. I mean, Freedom House not only downgraded India's status to partly free in its democratic rankings, but it downgraded the status of Jammu and Kashmir, for instance, to not free. So there are very real concerns and evidence to suggest that there is something very serious happening to the quality of Indian democracy. And yet, at home in India, there is also a very vibrant electoral scene. We have had nothing approximating events, for instance, in the US or in Brazil, where an incumbent government has sought to prevent a rival taking office, and there continues to be rotations of power both at the state level and at the national level. We're just this week awaiting results from a key set of state elections, which in some ways tell us that democracy or the electoral side of democracy is still alive and kicking. We can get deeper into whether there's a level playing field within that that system of electoral democracy. But I think all of that makes it harder for the critique of democracy and human rights to become a impediment to India's foreign relations, and yet it is likely to be an ongoing irritant. And we may see in this country, with the potential for another government to come to power next year, a somewhat different line, towards some of those human rights questions.
And drilling into the specifics, Chisha, I might ask you about this. I mean, we know that there was, the Canadian government has said that India has been involved in an official level in an assassination of a Sikh separatist, and the US now saying that there was an Indian government involvement in an attempted assassination of a Sikh separatist. I mean, obviously, from a Western perspective, these are viewed as sort of extrajudicial, extraterritorial assassination, attempt assassination. It seems to ought to be a big problem, but do you think it is actually going to be a problem for the bilateral relationship? It's obviously a problem for human rights in various countries, but is it a problem for the bilateral relationships with India, do you think? Or in the end, on both sides, is the sort of the Bismarckian realpolitik gonna win the day while we turn the other cheek?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see the contrast between the Canadian approach to this issue and the U.S. approach, and the U.S. has tried to handle it far more discreetly. So I think in some ways that reflects the level of importance that they place on the bilateral relationship with India. But I think it's interesting to see. I mean, this is a story that refuses to go away, and I think there's several important broader implications. One which has not really been talked about is India's relations with the diaspora community. India has the world's largest diaspora community, over 18 million people. They're generally seen to be as a source of strength for India's foreign policy. You see the very warm welcome that Prime Minister Modi has received when he travels abroad from overseas Indian communities. But this has shown, the dark side of that, when you have overseas Indian communities engaged in activities that are challenging India's sovereignty and status, that could potentially lead to bilateral relations deteriorating, which is clearly what's happened in the case of Canada. But you could foresee something similar happening in the case of the UK, Australia, the US. So I think that is one consideration that we need to keep in mind. I think it also, there are perhaps limits on the level of engagement between the West and India. I don't think India was ever going to become a member of the Five Eyes or the AUKUS arrangements, but it does essentially, potentially raise questions about the level of intelligence cooperation that could exist between the US and India, for example. Because what we've seen is that India is essentially these allegations of it being a liberal democracy or an electoral autocracy. These issues have been to some extent sidelined in India's engagements with the West and the US in particular. But when we see these spillover effects, like what's happened in the case of Canada, it is obviously it could have a potential impact on the long-term trajectory of the relationship.
And obviously, we often, from the outside, we think, what does this mean for how we engage with India? But Ambassador Saray, I mean, how far does India's democracy, with its good and bad, like all our democracies, in its own way, how does India's democracy actually affect the worldview of India and India's foreign policy? Do you see sort of direct linkages between Indian democracy and Indian foreign policy?
I think India's democracy is important for its own people. I think the external dimension of this is secondary in my view. But let me make the point that when you have common political values, shared democratic values, these may reinforce what are already convergent interests, say security interests. Now, you saw that during the Cold War, for example, despite the fact that India was perhaps in today's terms much more of a liberal democracy than may be considered today, and yet we were on the two sides of the fence as far as most of the West was concerned. So during that particular period, shared political values did not guarantee, in fact, shared security interests. I think the converse is true today, that there are very strong convergent interests, and I would tend to the cynical view that as long as those convergent interests are there and persist, maybe the aspect of shared political values will not play such an important role. But I think for India itself, and what is the kind of projection that it wishes to make, to the outside world, I think being a vibrant democracy, a plural democracy, is something very important. And even though there are setbacks today in terms of how democracy is practiced in India, I am very confident that the sheer plurality of India, the sheer diversity that India has, in fact, is maybe not immediately, but longer term perspective, it is a guarantee that it will in fact remain a very, very vibrant democracy. It is difficult to see how India can manage many of the kind of tensions and pressures that are there within the country itself, were it not for the democratic dispensation.
Yeah, thanks for that. And in terms of other I'm going to come back to the elections at the end, but in terms of other bilateral relations, Kevin, I want to ask about the UK. I mean, there's been negotiations ongoing on this FTA, but we have elections coming up in both countries. What are the prospects for the UK-India FTA?
I will answer that question. Take a little tiny step back, if I may. Well, back 18 years. I arrived on my posting in India in November 2005. So it's 18 years I've been doing UK-India relations, and I have to say, this is probably the best the relationship has been. It's not without its bumps, but it's probably the best it's been. And one of the key reasons for that is the comprehensive strategic partnership and the 2030 roadmap that was signed May 2021. That covered healthcare, climate cooperation, defence and security, the people-to-people connects, and the trade and investment relationship. And the FTA is a key element of that trade and investment relationship. Now, negotiations are taking longer than the politicians said they would. I'm not referring there to the deal by Diwali that the former Prime Minister mentioned. That was just an alliteration that he couldn't resist. But when the negotiations were launched in January 2022, they did talk about a year in public, in private 18 months, which would have been this spring. Now, why have there been delays? I think the churn in prime ministers slowed things down. But I also think it's partly because business didn't want a quick deal that was narrow and shallow. Businesses did want something that had real substance. And if you've got the world's 5th and 6th biggest economies negotiating an FTA, you can't really do that quickly if you're going to do it meaningfully. So, the fact that negotiations were nearly 2 years in, I don't think many businesses are frustrated by that. But we're at a point with elections coming up, I think, that if the deal isn't concluded by, say, Republic Day, which is sort of 26th January, I think we're looking at picking up negotiations again in 2025. Indian general election this spring. If the UK general election is in the autumn next year, then you can imagine, particularly if there's a change in government here, you can see the governments getting back around the table in 2025. that type of delay, I think, will frustrate businesses. We're okay at the moment, but kicking it down the road by another 15 months, that's not a great place to be.
We're not going to talk about the UK politics today, but on the Indian side, Louise, I might come to you before we take questions from Faron. But, it'll be state elections at the moment, general elections next year. I mean, is a Modi third term a foregone conclusion? And sort of, if so, I mean, what do you think third term Modi looks like? How might it be different from what we've seen up to now?
Is it a foregone conclusion? I always wish one had a crystal ball, but it's impossible to predict the outcomes of elections. I think the BJP are probably going into these elections on the front foot. That said, the results from the state elections that we expect this weekend will be important because they will give us insights into the health of the main national opposition party, the Congress Party, which is either the incumbent party or the main challenger in all four of the states that are up for election. This is important because the Congress Party is the largest party in the main opposition alliance, the India Alliance, which was formed a few months ago and proclaimed that it would agree a seat-sharing arrangement before the Lok Sabha elections. If it were to manage that, that could potentially be game-changing because any dominant party like the BJP, but also the Congress Party in its heyday from the 1950s through to the 1980s, benefits from the fragmentation of the opposition. India's opposition is hugely fragmented, especially across region. So if there were a coherent national opposition alliance, then that could put a lot of pressure on the BJP and could make for quite an unpredictable election outcome. At the moment, I have to say, the prospects of a coherent seat-sharing agreement don't look great. But I think if Congress do well, better than expected in the upcoming elections, then perhaps that equation starts to change and their ability to bargain with other regional parties may start to change as well. What does a third-term Modi government look like? Is an interesting question. Of course, this third term, were Modi to come back, may be Modi's final term. And there's a big question about the post-Modi succession. So my expectation is that a third Modi term may, for that reason, be a slightly different kind of term because the BJP itself will have to look within itself and confront the potential liability of what has been a very centralized leadership, both of the party and of the country. I think it could be an interesting next term politically. In terms of the issues that we're likely to see in a third-term Modi government, I think we're likely to see, in some ways, more of the same. A kind of a bullish focus, obviously, on the economy, on infrastructure development. Some of these themes, which are kind of kicking around, may coalesce a little more around industrial strategy, what a green industrial strategy might look like. We alluded a little to India's climate ambitions to be a climate change leader. If those are actually to come to fruition, I think we'll need to start to see more meat on the bone, so to speak, in a third Modi term. I think it's worth just also remembering that these elections and possibly the aftermath will both be framed by, again, a quite strident form of Hindu nationalism. We're expecting the opening of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, which is considered by Hindus to be the birthplace of Lord Ram, but was also the site of the Babri Masjid, the Mughal-era mosque that was pulled down by Hindu nationalist volunteers in 1992. This is a really totemic moment and site for the BJP and for the Hindu nationalist project in India. So I think that is likely to overshadow the elections and the next, if the BJP were to come back for a third term. It also, that is also likely to be important for the reason that Ambassador Saran began this conversation. In spite of India's very healthy rates of economic growth, it has significant problems structurally in the economy, growing inequality, high levels of both unemployment and underemployment, one of the lowest rates of female labour force participation anywhere in the world. So those are, everyday bread and butter livelihoods issues which will not go away. And partly in response to that, we see the recourse to this rather strident form of majoritarian identity politics.
Thanks, Reese. Okay, open to take a question. So just raise a hand if you have a question, and tell us who you are and any affiliation if you have one. Why don't we start with up front.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yu Jie from Chatham House Asia Pacific Program. Firstly, let me congratulate my colleague Chichi's debut as a members event today. It's quite successfully. Really enjoy your chat. Now, come back to the question on China, India. I mean, this is our daily conversation. What I've noticed so far is that seems to be Beijing began to relaunch its so-called charm offense together with, like, for example, Japan this week, and then also last week, the summit between Xi and Biden, and so on and so forth. Are we likely to see, firstly, some kind of rapprochement between Xi and Modi in next year, in the election year, firstly? And secondly, if we are going to have a rapprochement, and which elements that India will perhaps to choose to offer to China in this sense?
And maybe Ambassador Saran, do you want to take that question first?
Yeah, well, I am not very optimistic about possible rapprochement between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping, at least not in the foreseeable future, because I think the issues that divide the two countries today, the frame within which they are looking at each other, I think it may not be possible really to come to some kind of a consensus on how to take this relationship forward. So I expect that things will remain much the same as they are today. What can India offer to China? Let me go back to a certain consensus which was reached between the two leaders in 2005 when I was Foreign Secretary. The consensus was India is not a threat to China, China is not a threat to India. There is enough space in Asia as well as the world for both an emerging China as well as an emerging India. That India is a great economic opportunity for China, and China is a great economic opportunity for India, and that the two countries have very convergent interests in terms of really shaping the global order. None of this has changed, by the way, in real terms. I mean, these remain as valid today as they were at that time. What has changed, as I said, is that China is now benchmarking itself with the United States of America. It does not see the same level of common interest with emerging countries like India and the others. I mean, this is very obvious, for example, in the climate change negotiation, where India, Brazil, South Africa, and China used to very much coordinate their positions together in the negotiations. Today, that is no longer the case, again, because the frame has changed. So I do not think that in the foreseeable future, there would be much of a change in this respect.
And Chichi, you want to add something?
Just a very quick point. So first of all, we've gone over a year without the appointment of a Chinese ambassador in New Delhi. So that in some ways reflects the state of the bilateral relationship. Also, interestingly, we haven't mentioned the T word, which is Tibet, which is one of the roots of the Sino-Indian hostilities back in the 1950s. And the Dalai Lama is 88 years old. He hasn't traveled abroad, I think, since 2018. So it's not going to be too long before we will see, we could see a potential tug of war between Beijing and the Tibetan government in exile in Dharamsala, in which India could be caught in the crossfire. So that could be another potential flashpoint in the Sino-Indian relationship.
We have a question from online from Andrew Tamworth about India's role at COP28. I mean, on climate change, can India be the world's teacher, or is India just keen to build more coal-fired power plants? Can you do both at the same time?
Well, I think India's position on COP, in some ways it's going to build on its, and I think Ambassador Sarno would be very, probably the appropriate person to ask it, but it'll be building on what it achieved at the G20. So we saw agreements reached on tripling renewable power capacity. We saw agreements, Global Biofuels Alliance, building on an International Solar Alliance, which was put in place earlier. Agreements on sustainable agriculture, on sustainability and a circular economy. So I think those are going to be some of the key focus areas. Obviously, again, echoing what we've been talking about, the voice of the global South, India will be very much be talking about climate finance, technology transfer. I think those are going to be some of the key priority areas and potential areas of friction.
But that's talking. I mean, maybe Ambassador, what's India actually going to do for the global South in global climate change negotiations? I mean, beyond its own benefit, does India have sort of ambitions in terms of the global climate change debate beyond its own sort of narrow self-interest?
No, is that a question to me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the main issue is, as far as India is concerned, and I suspect this is the sentiment amongst most of the developing countries, that the kind of commitments which have been made by the developed West, whether it is in terms of their own emissions and reducing them, in terms of whatever commitments they have made for finance to developing countries. Even the $100 billion which was supposed to be on offer has never been actually achieved. There has been hardly any technology transfer. So I think India would be very much articulating the position of great disappointment with respect to what those who are more capable in terms of finance and technology were supposed to do and had promised to do and have not done. So I don't think that on that issue, mobilizing sentiment or mobilizing support from most of the countries of the global South is going to be much of a problem. I think as far as India itself is concerned, yes, there will be a pressure on India on the issue of coal. I mean, you just said, is India going to start, producing more power from coal? That is likely to be the case because we have very few options. So while we will be expanding our renewable energy, power generation, it is unlikely that in the near term, India will be able to do without coal. And by the way, we do consider it rather unfair that a country like China, which has a massive capacity of coal-based thermal power, and which in the last couple of years itself has added something like 90 gigawatts of coal-based thermal power, does not seem to generate any kind of concern. But India, which is at a much lower level of coal-based thermal power, seems to be in the crosshairs all the time. So I should not come to you as any surprise if India is going to react to that in a somewhat rather assertive manner.
Yeah, thanks for that. We have a question here at the front.
Hi, I'm Jian. I'm an undergraduate student here, second year, and I just wanted to understand that if you ask a BJP voter today that why are they voting for BJP, they'd say that they would vote for Modi because the US president came and shook hands with him at G20. So I wanted to understand this idea of resurgent India. Is it backed by substantive change in foreign policy, or is it just the rebranding of the foreign policy in terms of International Yoga Day, in terms of Diwali being celebrated at Trafalgar Square or something of that? Yeah.
Do you want to have a go at that one, Louise? Or?
Sure. I mean, I reflect on this issue partly from having been in India during the G20 summit and in the kind of year running up to the G20 summit, and just witnessing the extraordinary way that the Indian government enabled the penetration of India's role as president of the G20 to trickle down through almost every aspect of social and kind of economic life, through to, there being G20 branding on exam papers that students were sitting in universities, right? It was impossible for anyone not to know that India was president of the G20. And I think that's a really powerful example of how Modi as world leader has been branded for a domestic audience. And as you say, I think for the average BJP voter, that is important. Modi makes Indians feel proud of being Indian. That doesn't mean to say that Indians didn't feel proud of being Indian before Modi, but they, through Modi, have a new means of identifying themselves as India and of understanding Indian pride. So I think a lot of this does go down to branding. And we've heard on the panel, I think, of actually a lot of ways in which Indian foreign policy sees much greater continuity pre and post Modi. But this is certainly a regime, and there's been in the last 10 years, the penetration of digital media in India has also, deepened hugely. And so the technology, the media available to the government to brand itself and to produce a kind of penetrative understanding of Modi as a world statesman has also changed. So I think, yes, for all of those reasons, this has been a successful branding exercise as much as anything.
I just want to build a little bit on what Louise is saying there. I'm drawing through something you said earlier, that Modi's third term is likely to be his final term. So if India is the next superpower, is an element of that down to Mr. Modi's sort of personality and rather than his position power? So how does India increase or sustain its foreign policy and economic influence post-Modi? So there is a transition the BJP would have to do. But also I think in terms of increasing the number of brilliant diplomats India has, and I'm looking at one of them sitting in the back row there. India's foreign service is full of top quality people, but I think it has to expand if it's going to exert its continued influence post Mr. Modi. You can't rely on one person to drive a nation's foreign policy. It needs a peaceful army of people to do that.
Just to mention, I'm not entirely convinced that this would be Modi's last term, but just putting that out there. If he gets reelected for a third term.
Just one last question right at the front here, lady in front.
Thank you very much. I'm Alice, and I'm an investor in emerging markets. I think contradiction was a term that's mentioned a few times today, and there are external contradictions in terms of multilateral relationships and India's position in the world, and there are also lots of internal contradictions. So going back to the question of the event today, will India become the next global superpower? Do you think what would stop India being a global superpower? Would it be external or internal factors? Thank you.
We probably have you have 30 seconds each, probably, to give us the last word. So, Ambassador Saran, what would stop India being the next emerging superpower?
Well, on balance, I would say how India handles its domestic, challenges would be the key. As far as the external environment is concerned, that you can always try and mold to your interests, or at least try to. But it is much more challenging to deal with the kind of very, very difficult challenges, developmental challenges, which India faces today, and which also spawn a lot of, social fault lines as well.
Kevin?
I think India can decide for itself if it wants to be a superpower, and if it does, what type of superpower that is. It won't be like China projects itself, it won't be like the US. So I think India can redefine what a superpower is and decide for itself whether it wants to act in that way.
I mean, I would perhaps challenge the very premise of this, the title of this meeting, but I don't think it's likely to be a superpower or a great power. It is an emerging major power. That's what it is. And in terms of the key risks, I mean, we've discussed the Modi issue and the BJP. I think the two key risks other risks that I would perhaps flag is climate risk. It's an issue which is not only India, but the broader South Asia region is very vulnerable to. We saw the devastating impact of the floods in Pakistan last year, and all it would take is a gradual increase in temperature to affect agricultural production in India, which would make it perhaps a net food importer once again. And then perhaps the other issue is that the demographic dividend that we like to talk about becoming a demographic burden if it's not able to. The government is unable to invest in skills improvement, education, and job creation. I think those are two potential risks.
Anything left in the can for you, Louise?
Not much, really. Thanks for coming to me last. I mean, I think, how does India harness its economic potential while producing, dividends for all Indians? And how does India harness its great pluralism, both, domestically, but also as a bridge to the world?
Thanks. Well, it was a really good question to end off with, so thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. We'll have much more to come on India in the coming months with the elections coming up, so stay tuned to our website. You can also sign up to our Asia Pacific Programme newsletter on the Chatham House website if you're so minded. But for now, please join me in giving a round of applause to our great speakers today.